Next day, 400 warriors blocked the mountain pass. Orphaned girls saved a native infant from coyotes. Sarah Bennett was only 14 years old when she found herself alone in the world. 6 months had passed since the terrible day when cholera took both her mother and father within a week of each other. The disease had swept through their small town in Missouri like an invisible demon, leaving behind broken families and unmarked graves. Sarah had no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents to take her in. She was completely and utterly alone. The wagon master, a gruff man named Jacob Thornton, had agreed to let her join his westward journey to Oregon Territory. It was the spring of 1867, and hundreds of families were leaving their old lives behind, chasing dreams of free land and fresh starts in the untamed West. But Sarah wasn't chasing dreams. She was simply trying to survive. In exchange for her passage, Sarah worked from dawn until well past sunset. She helped Mrs. Thornton cook meals for the family over open fires, scrubbed pots until her fingers bled, mended clothes by flickering candlelight, and watched over the Thornton children, 3 wild boys who seemed to delight in making her life difficult. The youngest would hide her belongings, the middle one would blame her for things he broke, and the oldest ignored her completely unless he wanted something. Sarah slept under the Thornton wagon on a thin blanket, even when rain turned the ground to mud. She ate whatever scraps remained after the family finished their meals. Often that meant cold beans and hard biscuits. Sometimes it meant nothing at all. Mrs. Thornton wasn't cruel exactly, but she wasn't kind either. She treated Sarah like a servant, not like a child who had lost everything. The wagon train consisted of 23 wagons in total, carrying families, dreamers, and people running from their pasts. They traveled in a long, dusty line through prairies that seemed to stretch forever, across rivers that threatened to sweep away their belongings, and over hills that tested the strength of both oxen and people. Every day brought new challenges: broken wheels, sick animals, children with fevers, and the constant, gnawing fear of what lay ahead. Sarah had learned quickly not to complain. Orphans who complained didn't last long. She kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to think too much about her parents. But in the quiet moments, memories would sneak up on her. Her father's laugh, her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, the warmth of being loved. Those memories hurt more than hunger, more than exhaustion, more than the Thornton boys' meanness. The wagon train had been traveling for nearly 2 months when they entered the mountain territories. The landscape changed dramatically. Gone were the endless prairies. Now towering peaks surrounded them on all sides, their snow-capped summits touching the clouds. Dense forests of pine and fir covered the lower slopes, and rocky cliffs rose like walls on either side of the narrow trails they followed. This was Shoshone land. Everyone in the wagon train knew it, and the knowledge made them nervous. Jacob Thornton called meetings every few nights, gathering the men around a central fire to discuss their route and the dangers ahead. Sarah would linger at the edges of these gatherings, pretending to work while she listened to the conversations the adults thought children shouldn't hear. The men spoke in low, worried voices about recent attacks on other wagon trains. They talked about treaties that the government had made and then broken, about lands that had been promised to the native tribes and then taken away, about families who had simply disappeared on these mountain trails. Some men wanted to turn back. Others insisted they push forward. They'd come too far to give up now. "The Shoshone have every right to be angry," one man said, an older settler with gray in his beard. "We're crossing their hunting grounds without permission. We're scaring away the game. We're cutting down their trees." "We have just as much right to this land as they do," another man argued back, younger and red-faced with conviction. "This is America. This land belongs to everyone." "That's not how the Shoshone see it," the older man replied quietly. Jacob Thornton would silence these debates before they could turn into fights. "Stay alert," he'd tell everyone. "Keep your weapons close. Don't wander away from the wagons. And for heaven's sake, if you see any natives, don't do anything stupid. Don't shoot unless they shoot first." But Sarah noticed something the men didn't seem to notice. Every day as they traveled deeper into the mountains, she saw signs that they were being watched, a flash of movement on a distant ridge, smoke rising from a valley that everyone insisted was empty, horses' hoofprints that hadn't been there the day before, crossing their trail. They weren't alone in these mountains. Sarah was certain of it. Despite the warnings and the fear that hung over the wagon train like a dark cloud, Sarah found herself drawn to the wilderness. After completing her evening chores, when the Thornton family was settled and she'd been dismissed for the night, she would walk to the edge of the camp. Not far, she wasn't foolish enough to wander into the darkness, but far enough to escape the noise and chaos of so many people living in such close quarters. The forest at dusk was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Birds called to each other as they settled into their nests. Small animals rustled through the underbrush. The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of sap and wildflowers. In those moments, Sarah could almost forget her loneliness. Nature didn't care that she was an orphan. The mountains didn't judge her. The trees didn't expect anything from her. She'd found a particular spot she liked, a small clearing just beyond the tree line where she could sit on a fallen log and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. It was her secret place, her sanctuary. For 20 or 30 minutes each evening, she could simply be Sarah, not the orphan girl, not the servant, not the burden. Just Sarah. Mrs. Thornton had noticed her evening absences and scolded her once. "It's not proper for a young girl to wander off alone," she'd said, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. What would people think? But Jacob Thornton had actually defended Sarah, which surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. "She stays within sight of the camp," he'd grunted. "And she's back before full dark. Let the girl have a few minutes to herself. God knows she works hard enough." So Sarah's evening walks continued, and they became the only thing she looked forward to each day. The wagon train had been following a particularly difficult trail for 3 days, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and cooler. Some of the smaller children complained of headaches from the altitude. The oxen struggled with the steep grades, and twice wagons had nearly tipped over on the narrow, rocky path. On the third evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sarah finished scrubbing the dinner pots and slipped away to her clearing. Bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that seemed to seep into her very soul. Her hands were raw from work, her feet ached in her worn-through shoes, and her stomach growled with hunger despite the small portion of stew she'd been allowed to eat. But as she walked into the forest, some of that weariness lifted. The evening air was cool and clean. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind currents with effortless grace. Sarah sat on her usual log and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the wilderness settling down for the night. That's when she heard it. At first, she thought it was an animal, a young fox maybe, or a wounded bird. But as she listened more carefully, her eyes snapping open, Sarah realized the sound was distinctly human. There was a baby crying somewhere not too far away, somewhere beyond the tree line, deeper in the forest than she'd ever ventured. Her first instinct was to run back to camp and tell the adults, but she hesitated. What if they didn't believe her? What if they told her she was imagining things and punished her for making up stories? And even if they did believe her, would they help? Or would they decide that a crying baby in the wilderness was none of their concern, especially if it belonged to the native people they all feared? The crying continued, desperate and afraid, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. She knew what it meant to be alone and scared. She knew what it felt like to need help and have no one come. She stood up from her log, her heart beginning to pound, and took her first steps toward the sound, deeper into the darkening forest than she'd ever gone before. Sarah's feet moved almost without her thinking about it. The crying grew louder with each step she took into the forest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and every shadow seemed to hide some unknown danger. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long fingers of darkness between the trees. She knew she should turn back. She knew the rules, but that baby's cry pulled at something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore. She pushed through low-hanging branches, her worn dress catching on thorns and twigs. The ground sloped downward, and she had to grab onto tree trunks to keep from sliding. The crying was coming from below, somewhere down in what looked like a ravine or a deep gully carved into the mountainside by centuries of rainfall. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The only answer was more crying, weaker now, as if the baby was running out of strength. Sarah reached the edge of the ravine and peered down. It was deeper than she'd expected, maybe 15 or 20 feet to the bottom, with steep rocky sides covered in loose dirt and small stones. The failing light made it hard to see clearly, but then she spotted it, a bundle near the bottom of the ravine, something that didn't belong in the wilderness. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Then her breath caught in her throat. It was a cradleboard, the kind she'd seen in drawings and heard the men describe around their campfires. A wooden frame wrapped with leather and decorated with beautiful beadwork that caught the last rays of sunlight. And strapped into that cradleboard was a baby, an infant no bigger than the Thorntons' youngest had been a year ago. But that wasn't all Sarah saw. A few feet away from the cradleboard lay the still form of a woman. She was young, dressed in buckskin clothing with her long dark hair spread around her like a fan. She lay at an unnatural angle, perfectly motionless. Sarah stared at her, willing the woman to move, to breathe, to stand up and take her baby to safety. But the woman didn't move at all. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together what must have happened. The woman had been up on the cliff above. Sarah could see the spot where rocks and dirt had given way, creating a fresh scar on the cliff face. She must have fallen, probably gathering herbs or checking trap lines, something that brought her close to the unstable edge. The fall had killed her, but somehow, miraculously, the baby had survived. The infant's cries grew more desperate, and Sarah realized she had to make a choice. She could run back to camp, get help, bring adults who would know what to do, but by the time she explained everything and convinced them to come, it would be full dark. And there was another problem, one that made her blood run cold. 3 shapes moved at the far end of the ravine. At first Sarah thought they were dogs, but as they crept closer to the cradle board, she recognized them for what they really were. Coyotes, 3 of them, lean and hungry, drawn by the sound of the crying baby. They moved with the cautious confidence of predators who'd found easy prey. Their heads hung low, their eyes fixed on the infant. One of them, the largest, was only about 10 feet away from the cradle board now. The baby's crying seemed to excite them, making them bolder. Sarah didn't think. She couldn't think. If she thought about what she was doing, fear would paralyze her completely. She scrambled down the side of the ravine, half sliding, half falling, on the loose dirt and rocks. Stones scattered under her feet and tumbled ahead of her. She landed hard at the bottom, pain shooting through her ankle, but she ignored it. Her eyes frantically searched for anything she could use as a weapon. A thick branch, nearly as long as she was tall, lay a few feet away. Sarah grabbed it with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, rough bark scraping her already raw palms, but she hefted it like a club and ran toward the cradle board, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Get away! Get away from him!" The sound that came out of her wasn't quite human. It was pure rage and fear mixed together, the sound of someone who'd lost too much already and refused to lose anything more. She swung the branch wildly as she ran, not caring about technique or aim, just wanting to make herself as big and loud and terrifying as possible. The coyotes scattered, but not far. They backed away about 20 feet, then stopped and turned to look at her. Their yellow eyes gleamed in the fading light. They were hungry, and they weren't ready to give up their meal. The largest one, clearly the leader, lowered its head and showed its teeth. A low growl rumbled from its throat. Sarah stood between the coyotes and the baby, her branch raised high, her whole body shaking. She'd never been so frightened in her entire life. The coyotes were wild animals, predators, and she was just a skinny 14-year-old girl with a stick. But she didn't move. She couldn't move. That baby was depending on her. "Go on," she shouted again, her voice cracking. "Get out of here!" She took a step toward them, swinging her branch. The 2 smaller coyotes backed up a little more, clearly uncertain, but the leader held its ground, weighing its options. Sarah could almost see it thinking, calculating whether this strange, noisy human was worth fighting. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's arms ached from holding the heavy branch up, but she didn't lower it. She stared directly into the lead coyote's eyes, remembering something her father had once told her about animals, that they could smell fear, that they attacked when they sensed weakness. She thought about her parents then, about how they'd taught her to be brave even when she was scared. She thought about all the nights she'd cried herself to sleep under the Thornton wagon, feeling worthless and forgotten. She thought about how nobody had been there to protect her when she needed it most, but she was here now, and she could protect this baby. "I said go!" Sarah screamed, and she charged forward 3 more steps, swinging the branch so hard it made a whooshing sound through the air. That did it. The lead coyote finally turned and trotted away, its companions following close behind. They disappeared into the darkening forest, though Sarah could still hear them moving through the underbrush, still circling, still hoping for an opportunity. Sarah didn't drop her branch. She kept it raised, ready, as she backed toward the cradle board. Only when she was right next to it did she risk looking down at the baby. Somehow Sarah was certain the baby was a boy, stared up at her with enormous dark eyes. He'd stopped crying the moment she'd chased away the coyotes, as if he understood she was there to help. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 months old. His round face was streaked with tears and dirt, but he was beautiful. The cradle board that held him was a work of art, covered in intricate beadwork showing patterns of animals and symbols Sarah didn't recognize. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, her voice gentle now. "You're safe. I've got you." She set down her branch reluctantly, keeping it within reach, and carefully unfastened the leather straps that secured the baby to the cradle board. He was surprisingly heavy, solid and healthy despite his ordeal. As soon as she lifted him free, he reached out and grabbed a fistful of her hair, holding on tight as if she were his anchor in a stormy sea. Sarah looked over at the woman's body, and her heart broke all over again. Up close, she could see that the woman was very young, maybe only 18 or 20 years old. Pretty, with delicate features and careful braids woven through her hair. She wore a necklace of turquoise beads and a dress decorated with fringe and more of that beautiful beadwork. This was someone's daughter, someone's sister, and this baby's mother. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered to the dead woman. "I'm so sorry." But she couldn't stay here. The light was almost gone and those coyotes were still out there. She had to get the baby back to camp, had to get him warm and fed and safe. Sarah picked up the cradle board with one hand, awkward but manageable, and held the baby against her chest with her other arm. He snuggled into her, his little fist still tangled in her hair, and made a small sound of contentment. Climbing back up the ravine while carrying an infant in a cradle board was nearly impossible. Sarah had to set the cradle board down and push it ahead of her, then climb a few feet, then go back for the baby, then climb again. Her ankle throbbed where she'd landed on it wrong. Her arms screamed with exhaustion, but she kept going inch by painful inch until she finally pulled herself over the top edge and collapsed on solid ground. She lay there for a moment, breathing hard, the baby still clutched against her chest. Then she heard a sound that chilled her blood. The howl of a coyote, closer than before, answered by two more howls from different directions. They were calling to each other, regrouping, coming back. Sarah scrambled to her feet, scooped up the cradle board, and ran through the forest toward the wagon camp. Branches whipped at her face and arms. Roots tried to trip her. The baby bounced against her shoulder but didn't cry, as if he understood they were in danger. She burst out of the tree line into the clearing where the wagons were circled. Campfires flickered, and people turned to stare at her, wild-eyed, covered in dirt and scratches, carrying a native baby in his cradle board. Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she sank to her knees just as Jacob Thornton came running toward her. "What in heaven's name?" he started, but Sarah cut him off. "Found him," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "In the ravine. His mother, she fell. She's dead. Coyotes were... I had to. People crowded around now, their faces showing shock, fear, and something else. Anger. You brought a Shoshone baby into our camp?" a man's voice demanded. "Are you out of your mind, girl?" Sarah clutched the baby tighter as the crowd pressed in around her. Faces loomed in the firelight, some curious, some frightened, but most were angry. She recognized Mr. Peterson, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard who always seemed to be complaining about something. He was the loudest voice now. "That baby belongs to the Shoshone," he said, jabbing his finger toward Sarah. "Do you have any idea what you've done? They'll think we stole him. They'll come after us." "I didn't steal him," Sarah protested, her voice small but steady. "I saved him. His mother is dead in a ravine back there." "Coyotes were going to... I don't care what was going to happen," Mr. Peterson shouted. "You should have left it alone. This isn't our problem." Sarah repeated, feeling anger rise in her chest despite her exhaustion. "He's not an it. He's a baby. A human baby who would have died if I'd left him there." Jacob Thornton held up his hands, trying to restore order. "Everyone calm down. Let's think about this rationally." He looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read, part frustration, part something that might have been grudging respect. "Tell me exactly what you found." Sarah explained everything as clearly as she could, though her voice shook. She described hearing the crying, finding the ravine, seeing the woman's body and the baby in the cradle board. She told them about the coyotes and how she'd chased them away. As she spoke, more people gathered until nearly the entire camp surrounded her. The baby, sensing the tension, began to whimper. He pushed his face against Sarah's shoulder, his tiny hands gripping her dress. "The question now," said Mr. Hendricks, an older man who owned 2 wagons, "is what do we do with it? With him, I mean. We leave him somewhere the Shoshone can find him." Mr. Peterson said immediately, "Set him out beyond the camp with the cradle board. His people will come looking for the woman. They'll find him." "And what if they don't find him before the coyotes do?" Sarah demanded. "What if it gets cold tonight and he freezes? What if—" "That's not our responsibility," Mr. Peterson cut her off. "How can you say that?" Sarah's voice rose, surprising everyone, including herself. "How can any of you say that?"
"He's a baby."
"Would you leave one of your own children out in the wilderness to die?" "That's different, Mrs. Adam," Henderson said quietly, though she looked uncomfortable. "Our children are... what? More important?" Sarah's eyes blazed. "More human? He has feelings just like your baby's. He's scared and hungry, and he just lost his mother. How is that different?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Several people shifted their weight and looked at the ground. The baby's whimpering grew louder, turning into full cries. "He needs food," Sarah said, "and water. Is anyone going to help me, or are you all going to stand here arguing while a baby starves?" Mrs. Fletcher, an elderly widow who traveled alone in her late husband's wagon, stepped forward. Sarah had barely spoken to the woman before, but she'd noticed that Mrs. Fletcher often sat alone in the evenings, reading a worn Bible by firelight. She had kind eyes, though they were sad, as if she carried her own heavy losses. "I have milk from this morning," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, "and some mashed vegetables left from dinner. The child needs tending, regardless of where he came from." She looked around at the other settlers, her gaze sharp despite her age. "I should think we'd all be ashamed to call ourselves Christians if we let a baby suffer when we have the means to help." "This isn't about Christianity, Eleanor," Mr. Peterson argued. "This is about survival, our survival. The Shoshone have been watching us for days. I've seen the signs, even if Thornton hasn't wanted to admit it. And now this girl brings one of their babies into our camp? What do you think they're going to do when they find out?" "Maybe they'll be grateful, Mrs. Field," Fletcher replied coolly. "Maybe they'll see that we're not their enemies, that we're decent people who help those in need. Or maybe they'll massacre us all." Jacob Thornton raised his hands again. "Enough. Here's what we're going to do. The baby stays tonight. We'll care for him, feed him, keep him safe. Tomorrow morning we'll decide what to do next. Maybe we can find where the mother fell and leave some kind of marker, let his people know what happened." And if the Shoshone come tonight?" Mr. Peterson demanded. "Then we deal with it," Thornton said firmly. "But I won't have it said that this wagon train left a helpless baby to die." "We're better than that, or at least we should be." He looked directly at Mr. Peterson. "If you have a problem with my decision, you're welcome to leave the train." Mr. Peterson's face reddened, but he said nothing more. He turned and stalked back to his wagon, muttering under his breath. Several others followed him, casting dark looks at Sarah as they went. Mrs. Fletcher touched Sarah's shoulder gently. "Come, child. Let's get this little one settled." Sarah followed the elderly woman to her wagon on trembling legs. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading now, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and the dawning realization of what she'd done. She'd defied the rules, gone into the wilderness alone, and brought potential danger to everyone in the train. But when she looked down at the baby in her arms, at his round face and frightened eyes, she knew she'd do it all again. Mrs. Fletcher's wagon was tidy and spare, containing only the essentials and a few treasured possessions. A photograph of a stern-looking man Sarah assumed was her late husband, a beautiful quilt folded carefully on a trunk, a small collection of books. The woman moved efficiently, warming milk in a small pot over her fire and mashing some cooked carrots and potatoes into a soft paste. "What's your name, dear?" Mrs. Fletcher asked as she worked. "Sarah Bennett. I'm Eleanor Fletcher, though I suppose you knew that already." She smiled softly. "You're the orphan girl, aren't you? The one traveling with the Thorntons?" Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar shame that came with being identified as an orphan, as if her parents' death was somehow a mark against her character. "I lost my daughter to fever 5 years ago," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, not looking at Sarah. "She was 16, and my husband passed 2 years after that. So I understand something about loss, about being alone." She tested the temperature of the milk with her finger, then poured some into a clean cloth, twisting it to make a primitive feeding device. "Here, let's see if he'll take this." Sarah held the baby carefully while Mrs. Fletcher pressed the milk-soaked cloth to his lips. He latched on immediately, sucking desperately. Relief flooded through Sarah. At least they could feed him. "What you did tonight took courage," Mrs. Fletcher said as they worked together to feed the infant. "Foolish courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. Not many people would have done what you did." "I couldn't just leave him," Sarah whispered. "I know, child, I know." They fed the baby slowly, carefully, until his desperate sucking eased and his eyes began to droop. Mrs. Fletcher showed Sarah how to clean him with a damp cloth and check him for injuries. Aside from being frightened and hungry, he seemed unharmed. The cradle board had protected him from the fall that killed his mother. "Look at this workmanship," Mrs. Fletcher murmured, examining the cradle board by lamplight. "The beadwork alone must have taken weeks to complete. Someone loved this child very much." Sarah traced one finger over the intricate patterns, animals she recognized like deer and elk, and symbols whose meanings she could only guess at. Stars, perhaps? Mountains. And repeated throughout, a design that looked almost like protective hands cradling the board. "His mother made this," Sarah said softly. "I'm sure of it." And now she's gone. But he's not, Mrs. Fletcher reminded her. Because of you, he's alive and safe. For tonight, at least. That last phrase hung in the air between them. For tonight. But what about tomorrow? As if reading Sarah's thoughts, Mrs. Fletcher sighed. The men are right about one thing. The Shoshone have been watching us. I've seen them too. Shadows on the ridges. Signs of their passage across our trail. They know we're here, traveling through their territory without permission. Will they attack us? Sarah asked, fear tightening her throat. I don't know. But I do know that if they've been tracking us, they likely know about the woman who fell. They're probably searching for her already. And when they don't find her baby with her body? Mrs. Fletcher trailed off, letting Sarah imagine the rest. The baby fell asleep in Sarah's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. He looked peaceful now, no longer crying or afraid. Just a baby, innocent and helpless, who had no idea his mother was gone or that his very presence might bring violence to the wagon train. What's going to happen tomorrow? Sarah whispered. I honestly don't know, child. Jacob Thornton is a good man, but he's also practical. He has to think about the safety of everyone on this train. 23 wagons, over 70 people, including children. That's a heavy responsibility. So he'll make me leave the baby in the wilderness. He might try, Mrs. Bang. Fletcher agreed. But he'll have to go through me first. She met Sarah's eyes firmly. I meant what I said out there. I won't stand by and let a baby die, and I don't care whose baby it is. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself to cry since finding the infant. Thank you, she managed to say. Get some rest, Mrs. Fletcher said, spreading out a blanket on the wagon floor. You can sleep here tonight with the baby. I'll keep watch outside and make sure no one disturbs you. But no arguments. You've been through enough today. Sleep. Sarah lay down carefully, the baby cradled against her chest. She could hear voices outside, people still arguing about what should be done. She heard Jacob Thornton's deep rumble trying to maintain peace, Mrs. Thornton's sharp tones demanding that Sarah be punished for her disobedience, and Mr. Peterson's angry declarations that they were all going to die because of one stupid girl's soft heart. But inside the wagon, holding the sleeping baby, Sarah felt strangely calm. She'd done the right thing. She knew it in her bones, the same way she knew her parents would have been proud of her. They'd taught her to help those who couldn't help themselves, to show kindness even when it was difficult, to choose what was right over what was easy. As Sarah's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion finally claiming her, she wondered about the baby's family. Were they out there right now, searching desperately? Did they know yet that their daughter, their sister, was gone? And most importantly, what would they do when they found out that white settlers had their baby? She would find out soon enough. Because dawn was coming, and with it the reckoning that everyone feared. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of urgent voices outside the wagon. For a moment she forgot where she was, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she felt the warm weight of the baby against her chest, and everything came rushing back. The ravine, the coyotes, the angry faces of the settlers. The baby was still sleeping peacefully. One tiny fist curled near his mouth. Sarah held her breath, listening to the commotion outside. Men were shouting, their voices tight with fear. She heard the metallic sound of rifles being loaded, the scrape of boots on rocky ground, the frightened whimpering of children being told to hide in the wagons. Mrs. Fletcher appeared at the back of the wagon, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. Sarah, stay inside and keep quiet, she whispered urgently. Don't make a sound, no matter what happens. What's going on? They're here, Mrs. Fletcher said simply. The Shoshone. Hundreds of them. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She clutched the baby closer, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. What do they want? I don't know yet. But Jacob is trying to keep everyone calm. Mrs. Fletcher glanced over her shoulder, then back at Sarah. Whatever happens, you keep that baby safe and quiet. Do you understand? Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump of fear in her throat. Mrs. Fletcher disappeared, and Sarah was left alone with the baby and her racing thoughts. She could hear Jacob Thornton's voice now, loud and trying to sound confident, ordering the men to hold their fire. Nobody shoots unless I give the order. Do you hear me? Nobody. They've got us surrounded, Jacob. That was Mr. Peterson's voice, shrill with panic. Look at the ridges. There must be 400 of them, maybe more. Sarah carefully shifted her position so she could peek through a gap in the wagon's canvas covering. What she saw made her stomach drop. Warriors lined the ridges on both sides of the narrow mountain pass where the wagon train had stopped for the night. They sat perfectly still on their horses, silhouetted against the brightening sky. Even from this distance, Sarah could see they were armed. Bows, rifles, spears. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the wagon train with an intensity that was more terrifying than any open threat. The wagon train was trapped. The pass ahead was narrow, barely wide enough for two wagons side by side, and it stretched for at least a mile before opening into a wider valley. Behind them, the trail they'd traveled was equally confined. The warriors had chosen their position perfectly. There was no way forward and no way back. "Why aren't they doing anything?" someone whispered loudly. "Why are they just sitting there?" "Because they're waiting for something," Jacob Thornton said, and Sarah could hear the fear beneath his forced calm. Or someone. The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, making a small sound. She quickly placed her hand gently over his mouth, terrified he would cry out and draw attention to the wagon. But he just yawned, smacked his lips, and settled back to sleep. Sarah released a shaky breath. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The sun began to rise, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But now the light only made it easier to see just how many warriors surrounded them. Mr. Peterson had been right. There were hundreds, maybe even more than that. An entire war party. "Jacob," a voice called out. It was Mr. Hendricks, positioned near the front of the wagon circle. "Someone's coming down from the ridge. Looks like I count about 20 of them." A group of warriors was descending from the eastern ridge, moving slowly and deliberately. They were in no hurry. Why would they be? The settlers weren't going anywhere. As they drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. The rider in front was older than the others, his long hair streaked with silver. He wore a magnificent headdress decorated with eagle feathers and carried himself with unmistakable authority. A chief, Sarah realized. This was their leader. The group stopped about 50 yards from the wagon circle. The chief raised one hand, palm forward, a gesture that could have meant peace or could have meant halt. With the language barrier, there was no way to know for certain. "We need the interpreter," Jacob Thornton said. "Where's Morrison?" "Here." A thin, nervous-looking man hurried forward. Samuel Morrison had joined the wagon train in the last town, claiming he knew several native languages and could help negotiate safe passage through tribal territories. Until this moment, his services hadn't been needed. He looked terrified. "Go out there," Thornton ordered. "Find out what they want?" "Me? Go out there alone?" Morrison's voice cracked. "You said you could speak their language." "Now's your chance to prove it." Morrison looked like he might be sick, but he swallowed hard and stepped through the gap between two wagons. He walked toward the Shoshone warriors with his hands raised high, showing he was unarmed. The watching warriors on the ridges remained motionless, but Sarah could feel their attention focusing on Morrison like a physical weight. The interpreter stopped about 20 feet from the chief and began speaking in a language Sarah didn't recognize. It sounded halting and uncertain, like he was struggling to remember the words. The chief listened without expression, then responded in a voice that was calm but carried clearly across the distance. Morrison turned back toward the wagons, his face white. "What's the story?" he says. "He says they've been following us for 2 days. He says his daughter went out to gather herbs 3 days ago and never returned. He says they found where she fell from the cliff, but they didn't find her baby." Sarah's grip on the infant tightened. Her heart was pounding so hard now she was sure everyone could hear it. "He says," Morrison's voice shook, "he says they tracked us because they believed we might have taken the child. He says if we have the baby, we must return him now. If we don't have him, they will search every wagon. And if we've harmed the child in any way..." Morrison didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The hundreds of armed warriors surrounding them made the threat perfectly clear. "Tell him we don't have his grandson, Mr. Nile," Peterson hissed from behind a wagon. "Tell him we never saw any baby." "Tell him?" "We have him." Sarah's voice rang out clearly across the camp. Every head turned toward Mrs. Fletcher's wagon. Sarah could feel their stares. Shock, anger, fear. Her legs trembled as she climbed down from the wagon, still holding the baby carefully in her arms. "Sarah! No!" Mrs. Thornton shrieked. "Get back in that wagon right now." But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't. The baby's grandfather was right there, and she could see in his weathered face the same pain she'd felt when her own parents died. He was searching for his daughter, for his grandson, just as she would have wanted someone to search for her if she'd been lost. Mrs. Fletcher appeared at Sarah's side, her hand on the girl's shoulder. "Let her go," the elderly woman said firmly. "This is the right thing to do." "The right thing?" Mr. Peterson exploded. "She'll get us all killed. Or she'll save us all. Mrs. Fletcher replied quietly. Jacob Thornton stepped forward, his rifle lowered but still in his hands. If you're going to do this, I'm coming with you. No, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. He needs to see that I'm not afraid of him, that we didn't hurt his grandson. Let me go alone. Absolutely not, Thornton started, but Sarah was already walking. She moved slowly, carefully, toward the group of Shoshone warriors. The baby was awake now, looking around with those enormous dark eyes, seemingly unafraid. Sarah focused on the chief, on the grief and fear she could see etched into his face. He was a grandfather who'd lost his daughter and thought he'd lost his grandson, too. She understood that kind of loss. When she was about 10 feet away, she stopped. The warriors had their weapons ready, but the chief held up his hand again, stopping them from moving toward her. I found him yesterday evening, Sarah said, even though she knew the chief probably couldn't understand her words. But maybe he could understand her tone, her intention. In a ravine. His mother had fallen from the cliff. I'm so sorry. I tried to help her, but she was already gone. The chief's eyes were fixed on the baby, scanning him for any sign of harm. There were coyotes, Sarah continued, her voice breaking. They were going to hurt him, so I chased them away and brought him to our camp. We fed him, kept him warm. We didn't hurt him, I promise. We would never hurt him. She took 3 more steps forward and carefully, slowly, began to unfasten the blanket Mrs. Fletcher had wrapped around the baby during the night. The warriors tensed, hands moving to their weapons, but Sarah kept her movements gentle and non-threatening. He's safe, she said softly. See? He's healthy and safe. The baby looked up at her and smiled, an actual smile, tiny and sweet, showing toothless gums. Despite everything, despite the fear and tension, Sarah felt her heart melt. The chief dismounted from his horse in one fluid movement. He was tall, powerfully built despite his age, and as he walked toward Sarah, she had to fight every instinct that screamed at her to run. But she held her ground, held the baby carefully, and waited. The chief stopped directly in front of her. Up close, she could see his face more clearly. The deep lines carved by years of sun and wind, the gray in his hair, and most prominently, the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He wasn't trying to hide them. He looked at the baby, reached out one trembling hand, and gently touched the infant's face. The baby turned toward the touch and made a happy gurgling sound. The chief closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion, words Sarah didn't understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. Thank you. Thank you for saving him. Thank you for bringing him back to me. Sarah held out the baby, offering him to his grandfather. The chief took him carefully, cradling him against his chest as tears continued to fall. He pressed his face against the baby's head, breathing him in, and Sarah could see his lips moving in what might have been a prayer or simply repeated words of love and relief. For a long moment, nobody moved. The warriors on the ridges, the settlers hiding behind their wagons, Morrison the interpreter, Jacob Thornton with his rifle, everyone simply watched as a grandfather was reunited with his grandson. Then the chief looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and she felt like he was seeing everything. Her worn dress, her thin frame, the sadness that lived behind her eyes. He saw her, not as an enemy or a stranger, but as another person who had known loss. He spoke to Morrison, his voice still rough with emotion. The interpreter cleared his throat. He says he owes you a debt that can never be repaid. He says you showed courage and compassion when you could have done nothing. He says, Morrison paused, listening as the chief continued speaking. He says he recognizes in you the spirit of someone who has also lost family. He says you understand grief. And because of that understanding, you chose kindness over fear. He says his daughter would have been honored to know that the person who saved her son was someone who knew the pain of being alone. Sarah felt tears streaming down her own face now. She nodded, unable to speak. The chief shifted the baby to one arm and reached up to his own neck. He removed a necklace, beautiful turquoise beads strung on sinew, with a central stone carved into the shape of a bear. With careful deliberation, he placed it around Sarah's neck. Through Morrison, he said, This belonged to my daughter. She wore it always. Now I give it to you as a symbol of the bond between our families. You saved my grandson's life. You are under the protection of the Shoshone people. Always. The chief turned to Morrison and spoke at length, gesturing toward the wagon train and then toward the pass ahead. Morrison listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression shifting from fear to surprise to something like relief. When the chief finished speaking, Morrison practically ran back to the wagons. "He's giving us safe passage," he announced breathlessly to Jacob Thornton and the gathered settlers. "Not just through this pass, but through all Shoshone territory. He says any wagon train that carries the girl who saved his grandson will be under their protection." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mr. Peterson looked stunned, his mouth hanging open. Several women began crying with relief. Children peeked out from under wagons where they'd been hiding, but the chief wasn't finished. He called out commands to the warriors on the ridges, and they began to move. Instead of attacking, they were descending the slopes, and Sarah saw that many of them carried bundles and packs. What's happening now? Jacob Thornton asked Morrison. The interpreter spoke briefly with one of the warriors who had accompanied the chief down from the ridge. "They're bringing supplies?" Morrison translated, sounding almost as shocked as everyone else looked. "Dried meat, herbs for medicine, and guides. The chief says the path ahead is dangerous, especially with the spring runoff making the rivers high. He's sending warriors to show us the safest route and to make sure we reach the valley unharmed." Sarah stood near the chief, still close enough to see the baby, the chief's grandson, who was now being passed around to other warriors. Each one greeted the infant with obvious joy and relief, touching his face, speaking soft words in their language. They'd been searching for him, she realized. All these warriors, they'd been looking for this one small baby, and they'd been prepared to go to war to get him back. An elderly woman appeared from among the group, her face lined with age and grief. The chief spoke to her gently, and her eyes went immediately to the baby. She let out a wail of mixed sorrow and joy, taking the infant from the warrior who held him and pressing him against her heart. The baby's grandmother, Sarah, understood. She'd lost her daughter but had her grandson back. The old woman looked at Sarah with streaming eyes and said something urgent to the chief. He nodded and gestured for Sarah to approach. Through Morrison, who'd hurried back over, the chief said, "This is my wife, Red Dawn woman. She asks to know the name of the one who saved her grandson. Sarah," she said softly. "Sarah Bennett." The grandmother spoke again, still clutching the baby. Morrison translated. "She says she will tell her grandson about you every day as he grows. She will make sure he knows that Sarah Bennett, a girl with a brave heart, saved his life when she could have walked away. She says your name will be spoken with honor in their lodges for generations." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She was just a 14-year-old orphan who'd done what felt right. She hadn't been thinking about honor or recognition. She'd just been thinking about a baby who needed help. But as the old woman embraced her, still holding her grandson with one arm, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since her parents died. She felt valued. She felt seen. These people, strangers from a culture completely different from her own, understood her in a way that the settlers in the wagon train never had. Over the next hour, a remarkable transformation took place. What had begun as a tense standoff turned into something else entirely. The Shoshone warriors distributed their supplies among the wagons, showing no favoritism, making sure every family received meat and herbs. They checked the wagon wheels and pointed out problems that could cause breakdowns on the mountain trails ahead. Several warriors built up the cooking fires and showed the settler women how to prepare certain roots and plants that grew in the mountains, which ones were safe to eat, which ones had medicinal properties, which ones to avoid. Mrs. Fletcher listened attentively, asking questions through Morrison, genuinely interested in learning. Children from the wagon train, initially terrified, began peeking out with curiosity. Some of the younger Shoshone warriors smiled at them and made simple gestures, showing them how to make bird calls, demonstrating how to identify animal tracks in the dirt. Language wasn't needed for these small moments of connection. The chief walked through the camp with Jacob Thornton, occasionally stopping to point at the mountains ahead and explain something through Morrison. Thornton listened carefully, his earlier fear replaced by cautious respect. At one point, Sarah saw him offer his hand to the chief. The two men shook, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, that they were both leaders trying to protect their people. Not everyone in the wagon train was pleased with this turn of events. Sarah noticed Mr. Peterson standing apart, his arms crossed, his face set in stubborn disapproval. A few others clustered near him, muttering among themselves. But they were the minority now. Most of the settlers seemed overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness they were receiving. Mrs. Thornton approached Sarah with an expression the girl had never seen before. It might have been embarrassment or possibly even shame. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly. "I was wrong about what you did. If you hadn't brought that baby back, we'd all likely be dead right now." It wasn't a warm apology, and it didn't erase the months of treating Sarah like a servant rather than a child who needed care. But it was something. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah said simply. Mrs. Bin and Sood. Thornton hesitated, as if She wanted to say more, then nodded curtly and walked away. Fletcher found Sarah sitting near the chief's wife, watching as the old woman fed her grandson. "How are you holding up, dear?" the elderly woman asked, settling down beside her with a soft grunt. "I still can't believe this is happening," Sarah admitted. "Yesterday I thought they were going to make me leave him in the woods. Today they're treating me like I did something heroic." "You did do something heroic," Mrs. Fletcher said firmly. "You risked your life for a child who wasn't your own, who many people would have left to die. That takes a special kind of courage." "I was terrified the whole time. Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing what's right even when you're scared to death." Mrs. Fletcher patted Sarah's hand. "Your parents would have been very proud of you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her parents. "I miss them so much. I know you do, child, but they raised you well." "That's clear from the person you've become. The baby," Sarah realized she still didn't know his name, had fallen asleep in his grandmother's arms. The old woman sang softly to him, a lullaby in her language that sounded beautiful even without understanding the words. Sarah found herself humming along with the melody, and the grandmother smiled at her. As the morning wore on, the chief began organizing the departure. 6 Shoshone warriors would accompany the wagon train through the mountain pass, he explained through Morrison. They would show the safest crossing points at the rivers, warn of unstable trails, and ensure that the settlers reached the valley safely. "Tell him we're grateful," Jacob Thornton said to Morrison. Tell him I'm sorry for the wrongs that have been done to his people by men who look like me. Tell him not all of us are the same." Morrison translated, and the chief regarded Thornton thoughtfully before responding. "He says he knows there are good people and bad people in every tribe, every nation. He says what matters is what each person chooses to do when faced with a choice between kindness and cruelty. He says today, your people chose kindness by caring for his grandson. He will remember that." The wagons began preparing to move out. Oxen were yoked, children were gathered, supplies were secured. The Shoshone warriors who weren't staying as guides began mounting their horses, preparing to return to their main village with the chief and his family. Sarah stood watching, feeling strangely sad to see them go. The chief's wife approached her one final time, still carrying her grandson. She spoke at length, gesturing between the baby and Sarah, then touching her own heart and pointing to Sarah's. Morrison translated. "She says their lodge will always be open to you. If you ever need help, if you're ever in trouble, you need only find the Shoshone people and speak your name. They will help you as you help them. She says you are family now." The old woman carefully removed a small beaded pouch from her belt and pressed it into Sarah's hands. Inside, Sarah found what looked like seeds and dried herbs. Morrison explained. "She says these are sacred plants. The seeds you can plant wherever you settle. When they grow, you'll remember this day. The herbs are for healing. They'll help with wounds, fevers, and pain. She wants you to have them." Sarah's throat was too tight to speak. She just nodded and hugged the old woman, who held her tightly despite still holding the baby. The chief came over then, and for the first time, he smiled at Sarah. He spoke directly to her, not waiting for Morrison to translate, as if hoping she might understand through tone and gesture alone. Then he gently took her hand and placed it on his grandson's head in a gesture of blessing. Morrison caught up and provided the translation. "He says you gave him back his reason for living. His daughter is gone and that grief will never fully heal, but you saved her son. You saved the future of their family. He says the spirits guided you to find the baby, and he believes you were meant to be part of this child's story." The chief added something else, and Morrison smiled as he translated. "He says they've decided on a name for the boy. They're going to call him Saved by Kind Heart. It's a name that will remind everyone who hears it that one girl's compassion changed everything." The baby, Saved by Kind Heart, woke up and looked at Sarah with those big dark eyes. He reached out one tiny hand toward her face, and Sarah let him grab her finger. She wished she could tell him about his mother, about how beautiful she'd looked even in death, about the love that had gone into making his cradle board, but those were stories his grandparents would tell him as he grew. "You be strong," Sarah whispered to him, "and you be kind. And you remember that your mother loved you enough to make you the most beautiful cradle board I've ever seen." The chief's family mounted their horses, with the grandmother carefully securing the baby in his cradle board. The chief raised his hand in farewell, and every warrior on the ridges and in the camp raised theirs in response. Then they turned and rode away, disappearing into the mountains as quietly as they'd appeared. The wagon train began moving through the pass with their Shoshone guides leading the way. The guides proved invaluable, pointing out weak spots in the trail, helping to leverage wagons over difficult terrain, and showing them where to find fresh water and good campsites. Sarah rode in Mrs. Fletcher's wagon now, at the elderly woman's insistence. "You're not sleeping under the Thornton wagon anymore," Mrs. Fletcher had declared. "You're staying with me? I could use the company, and I think you could too." It was the first time since her parents died that Sarah had felt like she had a real place to belong. Mrs. Fletcher treated her like a granddaughter, teaching her things, talking to her like an equal, making sure she ate enough and rested when she was tired. The journey through the mountains took another 2 weeks, but with the Shoshone guides, they encountered none of the disasters that might have befallen them otherwise. They forded rivers at the safest points, avoided trails weakened by rock slides, and made good time through terrain that would have been treacherous without experienced guidance. When they finally reached the valley and the guides prepared to return to their people, Jacob Thornton gave them gifts, tools, blankets, and a letter addressed to any other settlers they might encounter, explaining the kindness the Shoshone had shown and asking that it be repaid with respect and fairness. The wagon train continued on to Oregon, and Sarah and Mrs. Fletcher eventually settled on a small piece of land near a growing town. Mrs. Fletcher formally adopted Sarah, giving her a real family again. The old woman taught Sarah to read better, to write clearly, to think for herself, and to never be afraid of standing up for what was right. Sarah planted the seeds the chief's wife had given her. They grew into beautiful plants with purple flowers that bloomed every spring, and Sarah tended them carefully, remembering the day that changed her life. As Sarah grew older, she became a teacher. She taught children, both settler children and native children, believing that education could build bridges between cultures. She never forgot the lessons she'd learned in those mountains, that kindness could prevent wars, that compassion knew no boundaries, and that one person's brave choice could ripple out to change countless lives. The turquoise necklace never left her neck. She wore it every day for the next 59 years, and it became her trademark. Students would ask about it, and she would tell them the story, every time with the same passion, the same detail, the same message, that we are all connected, that every life has value, and that choosing to help instead of turning away. When Sarah passed away at 73, surrounded by students who become teachers themselves, carrying on her legacy of compassion and understanding, she left instructions in her will. The necklace was to be returned to the Shoshone people, along with a letter she'd written telling the full story of that day in the mountains. A young teacher made the journey to find a Shoshone, carrying the necklace and the letter. When she arrived at their settlement, she was greeted by an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes. His name, she learned, was Saved by Kind Heart, and he was now a chief himself, known for his wisdom and his advocacy for peace between peoples. When she gave him the necklace and explained who Sarah Bennett had been, tears flowed down the old chief's face. "I've told my children and grandchildren about her my whole life," he said. "The girl who saved me from the Coyotes. The girl who gave me back to my family. I knew her for only a few hours, but her kindness shaped everything I became." He accepted the necklace with reverence and promised it would be kept in a place of honor, a reminder to future generations that one act of courage and compassion had prevented a war and built a bridge between two peoples who'd had every reason to be enemies. And in that moment, Sarah's story came full circle. A story of an orphan girl who saved a baby, who saved a wagon train, who saved herself, and who spent her life saving others through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing kindness over fear, connection over division, and love over hate. Her legacy lived on not in monuments or history books, but in the countless lives she touched, in the children she taught, and in the reminder that we all carry within us the power to change the world, one brave, compassionate choice at a time.